The wind carried ash across the empty platform that November morning, settling on iron rails that stretched into fog like twin veins bleeding into nowhere. The train sat motionless, its massive body exhaling steam into cold air, passengers filing out with the weary shuffle of people who had traveled through the night. Station attendants moved between cars with mechanical efficiency, checking seats and overhead compartments, their routine as practiced as breathing. Nobody noticed at first. Nobody thought to count. Railway conductor Hollis Brennan had worked the Westridge to Denver line for 18 years. He knew the rhythm of arrivals, the way passengers moved like water finding level, dispersing into waiting rooms and taxicabs with predictable flow. But something felt wrong that morning. He stood on the platform with his clipboard, watching the last stragglers emerge, and the numbers refused to align. The manifest in his hand showed 73 passengers boarded at Westridge the previous evening. 71 walked off in Denver. He counted again, then a third time. The arithmetic remained stubborn, immutable. 2 people had simply ceased to exist somewhere between departure and arrival. The train had made no stops. That detail would become the cornerstone of everything that followed, the impossible fact around which all speculation would orbit. The route from Westridge to Denver covered 340 miles of continuous track through mountain passes and high desert. No stations, no scheduled breaks. The locomotive pulled forward through darkness while passengers slept or read or stared at their reflections in black windows, and somewhere in those hours, 2 human beings vanished. Hollis walked the length of the train alone before reporting anything. Protocol demanded thoroughness, and he had no desire to sound alarms over a clerical error. He moved through each car slowly, looking under seats, checking lavatories, opening luggage compartments. The dining car sat empty, tables cleared and wiped clean, salt and pepper shakers standing at attention. The sleeping cars showed unmade bunks and rumpled blankets, the intimate disorder of temporary occupation. Nothing unusual, nothing that screamed of violence or struggle or explanation. The authorities arrived by mid-morning. Westridge Police Department sent Detective Margaret Fisk, a woman in her early 40s with graying hair pulled tight and eyes that absorbed details like photographic plates. She brought 2 junior officers and a skepticism born from years of watching simple explanations hide beneath complicated appearances. People did not vanish from moving trains. People made mistakes with headcounts, or changed seats, or disembarked in confusion. There would be a reasonable answer. But the records told a different story. The ticket agent in Westridge remembered selling exactly 73 passages. Conductor Brennan had personally counted passengers during boarding, checking names against his manifest. The numbers matched then. They did not match now. Detective Fisk ordered the train held at the station. Every car would be searched again, this time with methodical precision. Officers moved through with notebooks and cameras, documenting seat arrangements, photographing abandoned belongings. In Car 7, they found a woman's purse tucked beneath a seat, leather worn soft with age, contents undisturbed. Wallet inside held identification for someone named Cordelia Vance, 41 years old, address listed in Westridge. Her ticket stub sat folded in a side pocket, seat assignment 7B. The seat itself showed signs of use, the cushion still bearing a slight depression, a scarf draped over the armrest in careless abandon. 3 rows back they found the second anomaly. A briefcase, expensive leather with brass fittings, monogrammed with the initials RTH. Inside were business documents belonging to Randall Huxley, an accountant from Westridge traveling to Denver for a conference. His coat hung on the seat hook, pockets containing a hotel confirmation and a half-finished pack of cigarettes. Everything suggested imminent return, the casual arrangement of belongings left by someone stepping away for a moment, not someone departing forever. Detective Fisk stood in the aisle between the 2 seats, and tried to construct possibility from absence. The distance between 7B and 10F seemed vast suddenly, an ocean of burgundy upholstery and metal frames. No evidence suggested the two passengers knew each other. Their lives appeared to run on separate tracks, intersecting only in the random geometry of assigned seating. Cordelia Vance worked as a librarian, her purse containing a paperback novel and reading glasses. Randall Huxley dealt in numbers and balance sheets. Nothing connected them except disappearance. The investigation expanded backwards, retracing the lives of the missing before they boarded. Cordelia lived alone in a narrow house on Maple Street in Westridge, a neighborhood of modest homes with front porches and gardens gone dormant for winter. Neighbors described her as quiet, reliable, the kind of woman who waved hello but rarely stopped to chat. She had worked at the Westridge Public Library for 19 years, cataloging books and helping patrons find obscure references. Coworkers said she seemed unchanged in the days before her trip, perhaps slightly excited about visiting her sister in Denver, a rare break from routine. Her sister, Lenora Marsh, waited at Denver Station that morning and never saw Cordelia emerge. She stood on the platform for 2 hours, watching the crowd thin to nothing, before approaching station personnel with growing panic. By then the police were already involved, already beginning to understand the shape of something unprecedented. Randall Huxley left behind a wife and 2 teenage sons in a larger house on the eastern edge of Westridge. His wife, Pauline, described him as dependable to the point of predictability. He caught the same train to Denver every quarter for regional accounting conferences. He always called when he arrived. He always returned on schedule. The morning he disappeared, Pauline stood in her kitchen waiting for the phone to ring, and it remained silent. His employer, a firm called Dalton and Associates, confirmed Randall had seemed perfectly normal before leaving. He completed his work, filed necessary reports, mentioned he was looking forward to the conference. Nothing suggested distress or unusual behavior. His secretary said he seemed almost cheerful, whistling softly while organizing papers. 2 ordinary people leading ordinary lives, suddenly gone. Detective Fisk interviewed every passenger who had been aboard that night. The process consumed weeks. Most remembered nothing useful, lost in their own thoughts or sleep during the journey. A few recalled seeing Cordelia Vance reading by lamplight in her seat, glasses perched on her nose, occasionally turning pages with careful deliberation. Someone remembered a man matching Randall Huxley's description working on documents in the dining car early in the journey, coffee cup beside his elbow, expression focused. Nobody remembered seeing them leave their seats. Nobody heard arguments or sounds of distress. The train moved through darkness like a sealed world, and within that world 2 people simply stopped existing. The theory of voluntary departure gained brief traction. Perhaps they jumped from the train somewhere along the route, some mutual suicide pact or desperate escape. But the physics argued against it. The train maintained steady speed through the night, never dipping below 40 miles per hour. Jumping would mean certain injury, likely death. Search teams walked miles of track looking for bodies or evidence of impact. They found nothing except empty landscape and the indifferent silence of high country. Could they have hidden aboard somehow, still present but concealed? The train underwent complete dismantling at Denver Station. Workers removed seats, opened wall panels, checked every crawl space and maintenance access. They found dust and mechanical components and forgotten coins, but no people, living or otherwise. The case consumed Westridge and Denver both. Newspapers ran daily updates, each one offering less information than the last, speculation filling the void where facts should be. Television crews filmed the train sitting empty in the station yard, its windows reflecting clouds and nothing else. Reporters interviewed railway workers, psychologists, Anyone willing to offer theory about how two people vanish from a sealed environment traveling at speed. Months passed without resolution. Detective Fisk worked the case until it began working her, consuming sleep and peace and the clear boundaries between professional duty and personal obsession. She visited the train repeatedly, walking its length in darkness, trying to feel what the missing might have felt. The cars grew cold without heat, their interiors taking on the quality of abandoned theater sets, artificial spaces waiting for actors who would never return. The railway company wanted the train back in service. It represented significant investment sitting idle, and the investigation had yielded nothing actionable. Pressure mounted to release the cars, clean them, return them to rotation. Detective Fisk fought for more time, sensing something remained undiscovered, some detail hiding in plain sight. In late February, nearly 4 months after the disappearance, a railway mechanic named Thomas Creighton was assigned to inspect the train for return to service. He moved through each car with checklist and toolbox, examining brakes and electrical systems, ensuring everything functioned properly. Most of the work was routine, muscle memory and basic maintenance. He saved car 7 for last, working in the afternoon light that slanted through dusty windows. He noticed the panel first because it sat slightly askew. Between seats 7A and 7B, a maintenance access panel in the floor showed a hairline gap along one edge, probably nothing, a result of months of investigators tramping through, disturbing fittings. But Thomas had installed these panels years ago, and he remembered they fit flush when properly secured. He knelt down, running fingers along the edge, and felt the metal give slightly under pressure. The panel came up with minimal effort. Beneath it lay a dark space, narrow and deep, part of the train's skeletal infrastructure. Access ways for wiring and pneumatic lines, crawl spaces for repairs. Thomas shone his flashlight into the gap and saw nothing immediately unusual, standard components, everything appearing normal. Then his light caught something that did not belong. Near the back of the access space, partially hidden behind a support beam, dark fabric crumpled in shadow. He reached in carefully, fingers finding texture that sent recognition through his nervous system before his brain could name it. Cloth that had covered human skin, a shirt, and beneath it, pressed against cold metal, things that had once been warm. Thomas pulled his hand back and stood quickly, his breathing suddenly loud in the empty car. He walked to the front of the train without running, though his body wanted to run, and found the station supervisor. When he spoke, his voice came out steady despite the shaking in his hands. They found Cordelia Vance and Randall Huxley together in that narrow space beneath the floor of car 7, their bodies arranged with careful precision in the mechanical dark, where nobody thought to look deeply enough, folded into absence like letters sealed in envelopes that would never be opened except by accident and time. The discovery changed everything and nothing simultaneously. Detective Margaret Fisk received the call while sitting at her kitchen table, coffee going cold in her hands. Staring at case files she had never truly closed despite official documentation suggesting otherwise. Thomas Creighton's voice on the phone carried the weight of something that could not be unsaid, words that would reshape the landscape of the investigation she had walked away from but never abandoned. She drove to the station yard without remembering the route, her body navigating on autopilot while her mind raced through implications and possibilities. The medical examiner arrived before noon. Dr. Patricia Sorensen brought 2 decades of experience reading stories written in bone and tissue, translating the silent language of the dead into facts the living could understand. She worked with methodical care, documenting position and condition before removal, photographing the space that had held 2 people in darkness for months while searchers moved overhead, blind to what lay beneath their feet. The bodies showed signs of the confined space, compression and arrangement that spoke of deliberate placement rather than accidental concealment. They had not climbed into that narrow gap themselves. Someone had put them there. The revelation struck Westridge like a physical force. What began as mysterious disappearance transformed overnight into something darker, more malevolent. Murder carried different weight than vanishing, different implications for safety and trust. The train was no longer a puzzle but a crime scene. The passengers were no longer witnesses to absence but potential suspects who had traveled through the night with a killer. Lenora Marsh heard the news from a police officer who appeared at her door with rehearsed sympathy and careful words. Her sister Cordelia had not simply vanished into theoretical possibility. She had died violently and been hidden like trash beneath floorboards, treated as disposable, erased. Lenora sat on her couch after the officer left and could not locate tears, could not find the mechanism that allowed grief to flow. Instead, she felt hollow, carved out, as if the person she had been before this moment no longer existed, and the new version had not yet learned how to function. Pauline Huxley received the news differently. She was at the grocery store, pushing a cart through produce aisles, when her phone rang. The detective's voice carried across distance and told her what had been found, what it meant, that her husband was dead and had been dead since November while she waited for calls that would never come. She left the cart in the aisle and walked to her car and sat behind the wheel for an hour before she trusted herself to drive. Her sons were at school. She would have to tell them when they came home. She would have to find words for something beyond language. The investigation reopened with renewed intensity. Detective Fisk assembled a task force, pulling officers from adjacent departments, requesting resources from state agencies. The original passenger manifest became a roadmap of potential killers. 71 people had walked off that train in Denver, and one of them carried blood on their hands, literally or figuratively. The challenge was determining which one. Interviews began again, this time with different questions. Passengers who had previously discussed routine matters now faced inquiries about suspicious behavior, unusual movements, anyone who seemed nervous or out of place. Most remembered nothing helpful. The journey had been ordinary for them, unmemorable, the kind of travel that blurs into generic experience. Some felt defensive, insulted by the implication they might be murderers. Others wanted desperately to help, offering details that seemed significant but led nowhere. A woman named Claire Donnelly recalled seeing a man in the corridor near car 7 around midnight. He had been standing motionless, staring at nothing, his expression unreadable in the dim lighting. She remembered because she had needed to squeeze past him to reach the lavatory, and he had not moved or acknowledged her presence. But her description remained vague, generic features that could match a dozen passengers. When shown photographs from the manifest, she pointed to 3 different men with equal uncertainty. An elderly man, Bernard Foster, mentioned hearing metallic sounds from beneath the floor during the night. He had been awake with insomnia, lying in his bunk, and the noises stood out against the steady rhythm of the train, scraping, tapping, something being moved. He had assumed it was normal mechanical function, the operational sounds of a moving train. Now the memory carried sinister weight. But he could not specify timing with any precision, could not say which car the sounds originated from. The forensic examination of the bodies provided limited information. Dr. Sorensen determined both victims died from asphyxiation, deprived of oxygen in a manner that left minimal physical evidence. No signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, nothing that suggested prolonged violence. The conclusion pointed toward some form of chemical interference, something that rendered them unconscious before death, though toxicology results came back inconclusive after months of decomposition. The bodies had been placed in the hidden space shortly after death, arranged with care that suggested either remorse or simply practical disposal. Cordelia Vance's belongings yielded no clues. Her purse contained ordinary items, nothing suspicious or revealing. The book she had been reading sat open to page 63, a bookmark holding her place in a story she would never finish. Randall Huxley's briefcase similarly offered no insights, just business documents and professional correspondence. His coat pockets held receipts from Westridge shops, lunch from the day before departure, gas from the previous week, the mundane artifacts of normal life, suddenly rendered precious by their connection to someone gone. Detective Fisk focused on connections between victims. Despite appearances, perhaps Cordelia and Randall knew each other somehow, shared history that intersected in ways not immediately obvious. She traced their movements through Westridge, looking for overlap. Did they shop at the same stores, attend the same events, have mutual acquaintances? The search consumed weeks and produced nothing substantial. They lived separate lives in the same small town, parallel lines that never touched until the night they died together. The investigation began to fracture under its own weight. Too many possibilities, too little concrete evidence. The task force interviewed passengers multiple times, chasing inconsistencies and contradictions that amounted to nothing more than faulty memory and the distorting effects of time. Frustration mounted, resources strained. Pressure came from administrators who wanted results, politicians who wanted reassurances, media that wanted stories with satisfying conclusions. By summer, the case had stalled. No arrests, no clear suspects, no breakthrough revelations. The railway company settled financial claims with the families, offering compensation that could never truly compensate for loss, but provided acknowledgement and closure of a sort. The train returned to service after extensive cleaning and repair, the floor panels secured properly this time, the space beneath sealed as if it had never held death. Passengers rode from Westridge to Denver unaware of the history beneath their feet, the invisible presence of two people who had traveled this route one final time. Detective Fisk watched the case slip into the category of unsolved, filed away with other mysteries that defied resolution. She attended meetings where supervisors spoke about allocating resources to more promising investigations, about the practical realities of limited budgets and competing priorities. She nodded and agreed, and felt something essential inside her go dark. Failure was not new to police work, but this failure felt personal, a betrayal of promises made to the dead and those who mourned them. She visited Lenora Marsh to deliver the news personally. The case would remain open technically, but active investigation was concluding. If new evidence emerged, they would pursue it. But without leads, without suspects, without anything to follow, the work had reached its end. Lenora listened with the expression of someone who had expected exactly this outcome, who had learned not to trust reassurances or believe in justice. She thanked Detective Fisk for trying, words that felt like accusation despite their politeness. Pauline Huxley received similar notification. She sat in her living room with her sons, both older now, changed by loss in ways that would mark them permanently. She asked if they would ever know who killed their father. Detective Fisk could not lie. Probably not. Probably the killer walked free, lived ordinary life, carried the secret like luggage that never grew lighter but became familiar with time. Pauline nodded slowly and showed them to the door. Westridge absorbed the tragedy and moved forward the way communities do, incorporating horror into daily existence until it became background rather than foreground. The library where Cordelia worked hired a replacement, a younger woman who organized books with different methods and did not know the history of her predecessor. Dalton and Associates brought in a new accountant to handle Randall's accounts, someone efficient and professional who filled the role without filling the absence. Years passed, with the fluid inevitability of time refusing to pause for grief or injustice. Detective Fisk retired after 30 years of service. A ceremony with cake and speeches, that felt hollow despite genuine appreciation from colleagues. She moved to a smaller house on the edge of Westridge, filled rooms with books and silence, and tried to learn how to exist without the structure of investigation. The case files went with her, unofficially, boxes of documents and photographs that she could not leave behind. Some nights she spread them across her dining table and studied faces of passengers, searching for something she had missed, some detail hiding in plain sight. Lenora Marsh aged into a woman who smiled rarely and carried sadness like a permanent shadow. She visited her sister's grave every Sunday, placing fresh flowers and speaking to stone that offered no response. She never married, never moved away from Westridge, trapped by proximity to loss and unable to imagine life elsewhere. The house on Maple Street where Cordelia had lived sat empty for years, before being sold to a young family who knew nothing of its history, and filled it with noise and light, and the chaos of children. Pauline Huxley watched her sons grow into men, graduate from college, start careers and families of their own. She attended weddings and held grandchildren, and felt Randall's absence like a physical presence, the negative space where he should have been. She remarried eventually, a kind man who understood her grief and never tried to replace what was irreplaceable. But certain dates remained difficult, November especially, when memory sharpened and the wound felt fresh despite decades passing. The train continued its route between Westridge and Denver, carrying passengers who knew nothing of its history. The railway company changed ownership twice, records transferred and filed away, institutional memory fading with staff turnover and administrative reorganization. Car 7 was eventually decommissioned, sold for scrap, dismantled in a yard where metal was separated and repurposed. The floor panels that had hidden death became raw material for something new, history erased through industrial process. Detective Fisk died in her sleep at 73, heart failure that came quietly in the night. Her niece found her 2 days later, called by neighbors who noticed newspapers accumulating on the porch. The house was organized and clean, everything in its place except the dining table which remained covered in old case files. Photographs of people, long dead, spread across the surface like tarot cards offering no fortune. The niece called the police department, uncertain what to do with investigative materials that technically belonged to the department, but had clearly mattered deeply to her aunt. The files were returned to storage, boxed and labeled and placed in a warehouse with thousands of other cases, solved and unsolved, the accumulated weight of human misery and violence documented in paper and ink. A young detective named Marcus Chen was assigned to review the materials, ensure proper filing, check if anything required follow-up. He spent a week reading through decades-old interviews and evidence logs, constructing understanding of a case that had consumed resources and produced nothing. Something about the passenger manifest caught his attention, a name that seemed familiar, though he could not immediately place why. Gerald Pritchard, listed as passenger in Car 9, interviewed twice during the original investigation. Both interviews noted nothing suspicious, routine responses, no concerning behavior. But the name nagged at Chen, pulled at memory until he finally connected it to something recent. Gerald Pritchard had died 6 months earlier in Denver, elderly and isolated, found in his apartment by a landlord investigating unpaid rent. The death appeared natural, age and deteriorating health, but something about the estate settlement had flagged attention. Pritchard lived frugally despite having significant savings, money that seemed disproportionate to his documented income over the years. His apartment contained little of personal value except a locked trunk that had eventually been opened by estate administrators searching for will or documentation. Inside the trunk, they found items that made no sense in the context of a man who claimed no close relationships and lived alone. Women's jewelry, expensive pieces that appeared antique, A man's watch, silver with inscription too worn to read, photographs of people the landlord did not recognize and could not connect to Pritchard's history. And most peculiarly, newspaper clippings about unsolved disappearances and murders spanning decades, including detailed coverage of the Westridge train case. Detective Chen requested the trunk contents, driving to Denver personally to examine materials that might mean nothing or might mean everything. The jewelry was cataloged but not identified, no records of theft reports matching the descriptions. The watch was similarly anonymous, valuable but generic. The photographs showed people in various settings, different eras based on clothing and background details, no names or dates written on the backs, but the newspaper clippings told a different story. Pritchard had collected them obsessively, articles arranged chronologically in folders, annotated with handwritten notes. His comments ranged from mundane observations to strange speculation about methodology and timing. The Westridge train case had its own folder, thicker than others, containing not just published articles, but also notes that seemed to reference details not publicly released. Information about the hidden space beneath the floor, about the condition of the bodies, specifics that only someone connected to the investigation would know. Chen brought the materials back to Westridge and spread them across a conference table in a room that suddenly felt too small. He called in forensic specialists to examine the jewelry and watch, hoping for serial numbers or identifying marks. He requested fingerprint analysis on the newspaper clippings and photographs. He began the process of tracking Gerald Pritchard's movements and history, constructing timeline and biography of a man who had lived quietly and left behind questions instead of answers. The jewelry yielded results first. One piece, a distinctive brooch with unusual stone setting, matched a theft report from 20 years earlier in Montana. The victim had been an elderly woman found dead in her home, initially ruled natural causes but later questioned after valuables went missing. The case remained unsolved, filed away as probable robbery, the brooch never recovered until now. The watch provided more immediate connection. Despite worn inscription, forensic enhancement revealed 2 initials and a date. The letters were R and H. The date was 10 years before Randall Huxley died on the Westridge train. Chen contacted Pauline Huxley, now in her 70s but still sharp, still able to recall details from the past. He described the watch and she confirmed immediately. Randall's father had given it to him on his wedding day, a family heirloom passed down through generations. Randall wore it daily until it was found in his briefcase on the train. She had been given his effects after the investigation, including the watch, which she kept in a drawer and could not bear to look at. Except the watch in the trunk was not the watch returned to Pauline. That watch remained in her possession. Which meant Gerald Pritchard had somehow acquired an identical piece, or there had been a mistake in evidence handling, or the timeline was more complicated than anyone understood. Chen dove deeper into Pritchard's history. The man had worked various jobs over the years, nothing prestigious or particularly stable. Security guard, maintenance worker, warehouse stock clerk, positions that placed him in proximity to people and spaces, but never in positions of authority or visibility. He moved frequently, living in different cities across the western states, never staying long enough to establish roots or deep connections. Employment records showed he worked for the railway company during the time of the Westridge incident, though not as conductor or engineer. Pritchard was part of the maintenance crew, one of dozens of workers who serviced trains between routes, performing repairs and inspections. He would have had access to the trains, including Car 7. He would have understood the infrastructure, the hidden spaces, the ways a train skeleton could conceal things. The case folder grew as Chen worked backwards through time, connecting Pritchard to locations where other unsolved deaths occurred. The connections were circumstantial, geographical proximity rather than concrete evidence, but the pattern emerged with undeniable clarity. Wherever Gerald Pritchard lived for extended periods, deaths followed. Not many, not enough to draw attention, but enough to suggest something beyond coincidence. A woman in Portland who disappeared from her apartment, her body never found. A man in Salt Lake City discovered dead in his car. Apparent carbon monoxide poisoning that raised questions never fully answered. An elderly couple in Boise who died in their home, seen suggesting robbery but peculiarities in staging that troubled investigators. In each case, Pritchard had lived nearby, worked in positions that placed him in ordinary circulation through community, invisible until Chen made him visible. The evidence remained circumstantial, suggestive rather than conclusive. Pritchard was dead, beyond prosecution or confession. But Chen felt certainty that had nothing to do with legal standards and everything to do with recognition of pattern, the way facts aligned into narrative that explained what had previously been inexplicable. Gerald Pritchard had killed Cordelia Vance and Randall Huxley. He had likely killed others over years of quiet violence, taking lives and collecting trophies, and documenting his acts through newspaper clippings like someone maintaining scrapbook of achievements. Chen prepared a comprehensive report, documenting connections and evidence, building case against dead man who could never answer charges. He contacted families, including Lenora Marsh and Pauline Huxley, offering what closure decades-old answers could provide. The responses were mixed. Gratitude combined with anger at time lost, at years lived without knowing, at justice that came too late to matter in ways that should have mattered. The report was filed officially, the Westridge train case updated to reflect solved status, Gerald Pritchard named as perpetrator. Media covered the development with renewed interest, the story gaining second life as cold case resolution, triumph of persistent investigation, and modern forensic techniques. Chen gave interviews and accepted commendations, representing work that belonged as much to Detective Fisk as to himself, standing on foundation she built even when it led nowhere during her lifetime. The truth brought relief and resentment simultaneously to those who had lived with absence transformed into answer. Knowing was better than not knowing, but knowledge came decades late, arrived after hope had died and been buried alongside questions. Gerald Pritchard remained enigma, his motivations unknowable, his selection of victims random or following logic only he understood. The trunk contents suggested he kept pieces of lives he ended, physical reminders of moments when he held complete power over someone else's existence. Westridge absorbed the news the way it had absorbed the original tragedy, incorporating revelation into civic memory and moving forward. The case that had defined a generation finally achieved resolution, however imperfect. The train route continued operating, passengers traveling between cities unaware they rode through history, their journeys ordinary and unmemorable in ways that represented quiet triumph over violence that tried to make travel itself feel dangerous. Chen visited the site where Car 7 had been scrapped, standing in the industrial yard where metal was reduced to constituent elements. Nothing remained of the specific space that held death. The floor panels melted down and reformed into something else entirely. But the memory persisted, documented in files and photographs, and the changed lives of people who survived loss and carried it forward through time. Testimony that some things cannot be unmade or forgotten, that absence leaves permanent marks even when the missing are eventually found. The revelation settled over Westridge like snow that would never fully melt, becoming part of the landscape rather than covering it temporarily. Detective Marcus, Chen watched the town absorb the news through windows of diners and shops, seeing conversations happen in clusters, people leaning close to share what they had heard about Gerald Pritchard. the man who had walked among them carrying secrets that weighed more than anyone imagined. The grocery store where he had once worked still stood on Fifth Street, its aisles unchanged, but now people walked through with different awareness, remembering perhaps that they had stood beside him in line, had exchanged pleasantries with someone whose interior life contained chambers they could never have guessed existed. Chen spent weeks after filing his report thinking about proximity, about how violence lives next door and goes unrecognized, because human beings are not designed to see darkness in ordinary faces. Gerald Pritchard had been unremarkable by deliberate design, cultivating blandness like camouflage, understanding that invisibility was the greatest protection. He worked jobs that required presence but not engagement, positions where he interfaced with systems rather than people, becoming part of infrastructure that everyone depended on but nobody truly saw. The railway maintenance crew, the security desk at office buildings, the warehouse loading dock. Places where a man could observe patterns of human movement, learn schedules and vulnerabilities, identify moments when someone might be isolated enough to approach, control, eliminate. The trophies in the trunk represented more than evidence of specific crimes. They were autobiography written in stolen objects, each piece marking a moment when Pritchard felt most fully himself, most alive in ways that required someone else's death to achieve. Chen had seen similar collections before, the way certain killers kept mementos as combination of proof and prize, needing physical reminder that the acts were real, that the power they felt was not imagination but concrete fact demonstrated through another person's cessation. But something about Pritchard's collection felt different, more curated than compulsive. The jewelry and watches were not random grabbings but selected pieces, chosen for reasons that might be aesthetic or symbolic or following logic that died with him. The newspaper clippings suggested something else entirely, a need not just to remember but to see how his actions registered in the world, how they were interpreted and discussed and ultimately classified. Pritchard had followed his own press coverage the way some people follow sports teams, tracking investigation progress, reading speculation about methods and motives, perhaps experiencing satisfaction when police pursued wrong theories or frustration when they came close to truth before veering away. The annotations in his handwriting showed engagement beyond passive observation, moments where he corrected facts or questioned conclusions, speaking back to narrative that could not hear him, but mattered nonetheless to his sense of identity and accomplishment. Chen arranged to meet with Lenora Marsh on a Tuesday afternoon at a coffee shop in downtown Westridge, a neutral space where difficult conversations could happen surrounded by the buffer of other people's ordinary moments. She arrived exactly on time, a woman in her late 60s now, hair gone completely gray, wearing clothes that suggested she had stopped caring about appearance years ago and dressed now purely for function and comfort. She ordered tea and sat across from Chen with the posture of someone braced for impact, someone who had learned that conversations with police rarely brought good news even when they promised resolution. Chen walked her through what he had found, speaking carefully, watching her face for signs he should slow down or stop entirely. She listened without interrupting, hands wrapped around her teacup as if drawing warmth from ceramic even though the coffee shop was adequately heated. When he finished, she sat quietly for a long moment, steam rising between them like visible silence, and then she spoke in a voice that carried weight accumulated over decades. She said she did not know how to feel about knowing. For years she had constructed elaborate theories about what happened to Cordelia, each one providing different framework for grief. Maybe her sister had chosen to disappear, started new life somewhere else, found freedom in abandoning her history and identity. Maybe she had suffered accident, quick death without fear or pain, randomness rather than intention. Maybe she had been taken by someone who saw her as human being, who felt remorse, who had not reduced her to object or obstacle. Learning that Cordelia died because she happened to be sitting in a particular seat when Gerald Pritchard decided he wanted to kill someone felt both clarifying and devastating. Answer that explained everything while meaning nothing. The randomness was hardest to accept. Lenora wanted there to be reason, some chain of causation that made sense even if the sense was terrible. But Chen could offer no connection between Pritchard and Cordelia beyond geographical proximity and opportunity. She had not wronged him. She had not even known him. She was simply present and vulnerable at a moment when his need aligned with circumstance. Accepting that her sister's entire existence, all the years of cataloging books and tending her small garden and being kind to neighbors, could be erased because of coincidence and the interior darkness of someone she never met, felt like confronting void that had no edges and no bottom. Chen told her that knowing, even painful knowing, was better than the alternative, that the human mind could tolerate almost anything except uncertainty, which grew like cancer and consumed everything around it. That her sister's death had been solved, that the person responsible was identified, that even though Pritchard himself escaped earthly justice, the record now reflected truth rather than mystery. He knew the words were inadequate even as he spoke them, could see in her expression that platitudes about closure and resolution meant little measured against decades of absence and pain that would never fully heal regardless of what facts emerged. But Lenora surprised him. She reached across the table and took his hand, her grip stronger than her appearance suggested, and she thanked him, not for solving the case, though she appreciated that, but for caring enough to look at old files when he could have let them remain archived and forgotten, for connecting patterns that required attention and persistence to see, for giving Cordelia's death weight and significance in official record, elevating her from unsolved mystery to person whose murder was recognized and named. That mattered more than Chen initially understood, the difference between dying in obscurity and dying in a case that someone fought to resolve. The meeting with Pauline Huxley happened differently. She requested Chen come to her home, the same house she had lived in with Randall decades earlier, now modified and updated but fundamentally unchanged. Her second husband, William, greeted Chen at the door and offered coffee before retreating to another room, understanding that some conversations required privacy even within marriage. Pauline sat in a living room filled with photographs, multiple generations captured in frames covering every surface, visual documentation of life that continued after loss tried to stop it. She asked Chen to tell her everything, not just conclusions but process, how he found the connections, what the evidence showed, what could be known and what remained speculation. She listened like someone who had waited years for this exact conversation, who had rehearsed questions during sleepless nights and wanted answers delivered with precision and thoroughness. Chen obliged, walking through timeline and documentation, showing her photographs of the trunk contents, letting her hold the case file and read sections herself when she asked. When she saw the watch, photographed in evidence collection, she wept. Not dramatic crying but quiet tears that ran down her face while the rest of her remained still, grief that had been waiting decades for permission to fully manifest. The watch was wrong, she explained again. Randall's watch had been returned to her, she still had it, but seeing this duplicate raised questions she had never thought to ask. Had Pritchard stolen it earlier, before the train journey, planning already? Or had he taken it during or after the murder, and somehow a replacement made its way into evidence? The uncertainty felt like discovering the ground she stood on was less solid than she believed, that even facts she thought established were subject to revision and doubt. But what haunted her most was different than what troubled Lenora. Pauline fixated on the moment of Randall's death, the actual experience of his final minutes, whether he understood what was happening, whether he suffered, whether he thought of her and their sons. Chen had no answers that could satisfy those questions. The forensic evidence suggested asphyxiation, loss of consciousness that might have been rapid depending on method. But the specifics remained unknown, would always remain unknown, details that died with Pritchard and could not be recovered through investigation no matter how thorough. Chen told her what he believed, though he acknowledged it was belief rather than proven fact. He thought Pritchard had used some form of chemical agent, something that rendered victims unconscious quickly, allowing him to position them in the hidden space beneath the floor without struggle or noise that would alert other passengers. The train's movement would mask sounds of the panels being opened and bodies being concealed. By the time anyone might notice absence, the train was too far from origin for immediate search, and Pritchard was simply another passenger, unremarkable and unnoticed, who walked off in Denver carrying guilt no one could see. Pauline absorbed this and nodded slowly. She said she had imagined worse, had spent years constructing scenarios in her mind that involved prolonged suffering and terror, Randall aware and helpless while his life ended, knowing it was likely quick, clinical even in its horror, provided small mercy she had not expected to receive. She asked if Pritchard had killed others, and Chen confirmed what evidence suggested, that Cordelia and Randall were not isolated incidents, but part of patterns spanning years and multiple states. The number would never be known with certainty, some deaths classified as natural or accidental, others simply never connected to him, but the trunk suggested at least a dozen victims, maybe more. That knowledge sat heavy in the room between them. Her husband's death was not unique tragedy, but one iteration of repeated violence, Pritchard moving through the world like human weather system, leaving destruction in his wake while remaining invisible to those who might have stopped him had they known to look. Pauline asked why, the question that had no adequate answer, and Chen could only offer theories about psychology and development, factors that might contribute to someone becoming what Pritchard became. But causation was not excuse, and understanding origins did not make the outcomes less devastating or the victims less dead. Her sons arrived while Chen was still there, both men now in their 40s with families of their own, having taken time off work to be present for this conversation with the detective who solved their father's murder 3 decades late. They sat together on the couch, physical presence of grown men who had been teenagers when their father disappeared, and they asked questions that mixed practical concerns with existential ones. Could Pritchard have been caught earlier? Were there signs authorities missed? What did this mean for how they should remember their father and understand his death? Chen answered honestly. Yes, perhaps Pritchard could have been identified sooner if different connections had been made, if information had been shared more efficiently between jurisdictions, if his employment history had raised flags it did not raise at the time. But investigation happened in context of available technology and resources, databases that did not yet exist, analytical tools that had not been developed. Detective Fisk and her team had worked the case with dedication and skill, had done everything reasonable given what they knew when they knew it. The failure was not individual but systemic, gap between how violence operates and how institutions design to prevent it function. As for remembering their father, Chen said memory did not change based on how death occurred. Randall Huxley was who he was, defined by how he lived rather than how he died. The manner of his murder was fact that provided closure, but did not alter his essential character or the validity of their relationship with him. He remained their father, husband to their mother, man who worked steady job and came home and participated in ordinary family life. Pritchard took years but not identity, ended existence but not meaning. The older son, Daniel, said something that stayed with Chen long after the meeting ended. He said knowing was like surgery, cutting into old wound to remove foreign object that had been causing pain without being visible. The cutting hurt, the recovery would take time, But ultimately healing could happen now in ways it could not when the wound remained contaminated by uncertainty. His brother, Michael, agreed, adding that their children, Randall's grandchildren, would grow up knowing their grandfather's story had ending even if the ending was not happy. That completeness mattered, circular rather than trailing off into question marks and speculation. Before leaving, Chen gave Pauline a folder containing copies of documents he thought she might want, information that was public record but not easily accessible without knowing where to look. She accepted it with both hands and promised to read everything when she felt ready, though ready might be months or years from now. William walked Chen to the door and shook his hand with grip that communicated gratitude words would make awkward. The house settled back into its routine as Chen drove away, family inside carrying new weight but carrying it together, distributed load rather than isolated burden. The media attention faded after initial coverage, news cycle moving on to more immediate stories, but the impact rippled through communities in ways that would take years to fully manifest. Other families with unsolved deaths reached out to Chen, hoping their cases might benefit from similar cold case review, that someone might look again with fresh eyes and modern techniques. He could not help most of them, lacked resources and jurisdiction, but he connected people with appropriate departments and encouraged persistence, explained that resolution sometimes required decades but was still worth pursuing. A victims' rights organization invited Chen to speak at their annual conference about the importance of never truly closing unsolved cases, maintaining files and evidence even when active investigation ceased, because technology and methodology constantly evolved, and what was impossible to solve in one era might be solvable in another. He accepted, standing before audience of survivors and advocates, and talked about Detective Fisk's decision to keep working the case in her retirement, how her refusal to let go ultimately led to breakthrough decades later even though she did not live to see it. That dedication mattered, he told them, created foundation that made later resolution possible. He visited Fisk's grave after the conference, small headstone in Westridge Cemetery surrounded by others who lived and died in the same town, roots deep in local soil. He stood there without speaking aloud, aware that whatever consciousness she had or did not have after death, the gesture was more for him than her, way of acknowledging debt and expressing respect that had no other outlet. Her work had been invisible foundation, unglamorous and frustrating, leading nowhere during her lifetime but creating conditions for eventual solution. That was legacy too, even if it never received recognition it deserved. The case file was formally archived after Chen completed all follow-up documentation, placed in storage with notation that made it easily retrievable should future questions arise. The notation included Chen's contact information and request that any inquiries be directed to him, assurance that institutional memory would not be lost again, that someone would maintain continuity of knowledge. He copied all materials digitally as well, storing them in multiple locations, redundancy against loss or degradation. Years continued passing with their characteristic indifference to human concerns. Lenora Marsh died peacefully in her sleep at 74, heart giving out after 7 decades of steady service. She left instructions that she be buried beside her sister, plots side by side, names engraved on shared stone. The funeral was small, attended by neighbors who remembered her as quiet woman who kept to herself, but was never unkind, who maintained her sister's memory with faithful dedication that became defining characteristic of her later life. Pauline Huxley lived longer, making it to 83 before pneumonia claimed her during particularly harsh winter. Her sons arranged service that celebrated her full life, rather than focusing only on widowhood and loss, recognizing that she had been more than Randall's wife, had created identity and meaning after his death through work and relationships, and raising her children to adulthood. The funeral program included photograph of her laughing at family gathering, image that captured joy and resilience that characterized her approach to decades that could have been consumed by bitterness, but were not. Chen remained with Westridge Police Department, eventually making detective sergeant and then lieutenant, advancing through ranks while maintaining connection to investigative work that first drew him to law enforcement. He worked other cases, solved some and failed to solve others, learned that justice was approximation rather than absolute, that best possible outcome often fell short of ideal but was still worth pursuing. The Westridge train case remained touchstone, reminder of why the work mattered even when results were delayed or imperfect. He trained younger detectives, passing on lessons learned through experience and study, emphasizing importance of documentation and persistence, explaining that cases were rarely solved through dramatic revelation, but through accumulated small efforts that eventually reached critical mass. He told them about Detective Fisk, about Gerald Pritchard, about two ordinary people who died because they sat in wrong seats at wrong time. He made the story lesson about randomness and evil and the necessity of bearing witness, refusing to let victims disappear into categories of unsolved mystery, fighting to restore names and narratives even decades after death. The railway route between Westridge and Denver continued operating through all of this, trains running daily with passengers who traveled for business or pleasure or necessity, sitting in seats and watching landscape pass outside windows, unaware of history that happened on similar journey years before. The company updated cars regularly, replacing old equipment with new, maintaining service that connected cities and carried people through geography that could be crossed no other way except by car over slower routes through mountains. On the anniversary of the discovery of the bodies, some years after Gerald Pritchard was identified, a small ceremony was held at Westridge Station. No official memorial, no permanent marker, just gathering of people who remembered and wanted to acknowledge what had happened, to create moment of collective recognition that Cordelia Vance and Randall Huxley lived and died and mattered. Lenora was gone by then, but Pauline attended with her sons and their families, 3 generations standing together on platform where Randall had boarded train that final time. A local minister, invited by the family, spoke briefly about loss and memory, about how communities carry history forward through shared acknowledgement, about the importance of saying names of the dead so they are not forgotten. He spoke Cordelia's name and Randall's name, letting them echo in the cavernous space of the station, sound bouncing off high ceilings and tile floors before dissipating into silence that felt somehow different than it had before, populated rather than empty. Chen attended but did not speak, standing at the edge of the gathering and observing, present as witness and participant both. He thought about all the cases still unsolved, names that deserved similar recognition, but would never receive it because patterns remained undetected or evidence was lost, or simply because time and chance had not yet aligned in ways that allowed truth to surface. He thought about the randomness that Lenora found so difficult to accept, how arbitrary violence was in its selection of victims, how easily anyone could be in wrong place at wrong moment, and have their entire existence reduced to tragedy and evidence file. But he also thought about resilience, the way Pauline and her sons rebuilt life after devastation, the way Lenora maintained connection to her sister through decades of absence, the way communities absorbed horror and continued functioning, incorporating tragedy into narrative without being destroyed by it. That was not triumph exactly, not victory that balanced scales or made suffering worthwhile, but it was survival, continuation, refusal to let violence have final word about meaning and value of human life. The gathering dispersed after brief ceremony, people returning to their days and responsibilities, carrying moment with them as memory that would fade but not disappear entirely. The station returned to its routine operation, trains arriving and departing on schedule, passengers boarding with luggage and tickets and destinations in mind, moving through space that held history they could not see and mostly did not know existed. Chen drove back to his office and filed paperwork related to the ceremony, documentation of the day for records that almost no one would ever read, but that mattered nonetheless as evidence that remembering had happened, that official recognition had been given. He looked at the photograph of Detective Fisk he kept on his desk, image from her retirement ceremony, where she smiled with expression that suggested she was thinking about something other than the celebration happening around her, perhaps the cases that remained unsolved, the work that continued even as formal career ended. He wondered what she would make of the resolution, whether knowing would have brought her peace or simply different type of dissatisfaction, solution that came too late to matter in ways she wanted it to matter. But he thought she would approve of the ceremony, the speaking of names, the act of collective acknowledgement. She had fought to keep Cordelia Vance and Randall Huxley from becoming statistics or forgotten mysteries, had maintained their presence in investigative consciousness, even when leads exhausted and resources redirected. That fight continued through Chen's work, through the ceremony, through every retelling of the story that insisted victims were people with names and lives that mattered beyond how they ended. Evening settled over Westridge with the gradual dimming that characterized autumn in the mountains, light fading from sky in stages that turned clouds purple and orange before surrendering to darkness. Streetlights came on automatically, illuminating empty sidewalks and closed shops, the town settling into nighttime rhythm. Chen finished his paperwork and drove home through familiar streets, past the library where Cordelia had worked, and the house where Pauline had waited for phone call that never came and the cemetery where both women were now buried. He thought about legacy, how it manifested in unexpected ways. Gerald Pritchard left legacy of violence that would be remembered with horror and disgust, life spent causing suffering that accomplished nothing except demonstration of his own brokenness. But Cordelia and Randall left different legacy, visible in the sister who remembered and the sons who built families and carried forward despite loss. Detective Fisk left legacy in solved cases and trained detectives, an example of dedication that inspired others to persist when persistence seemed futile. And in some small way, Chen thought, perhaps he was building legacy too. Not through dramatic actions or memorable victories, but through steady accumulation of work done properly, cases investigated thoroughly, victims treated with dignity and respect regardless of how long ago they died or how little evidence remained. Through teaching younger officers that every unsolved case represented not just mystery, but person whose death deserved explanation and justice, even if justice came decades late and meant nothing more than accurate record and answered questions. The train continued its route through the darkness beyond town, lights visible from distance as moving constellation, carrying passengers toward Denver through landscape that held its own history of violence and survival and continuation. The route would keep operating as long as economics justified it, as long as people needed to move between cities and chose this method of travel. And somewhere in the files and records and collective memory of those who knew the story, Cordelia Vance and Randall Huxley would remain present, not as victims exclusively, but as people who lived and were remembered and whose deaths, however terrible and random, were eventually explained and acknowledged and mourned properly by those who came after. Chen pulled into his driveway and sat in the car for a moment before going inside, letting the weight of the day settle and then lifting, releasing tension he carried without consciously noticing it. The house waited with its familiar comfort, refuge from work that could consume everything if allowed to, space where he could simply exist without the burden of carrying other people's grief, and seeking justice for wrongs he did not commit, but felt responsible for addressing. To seek truth about even when truth came late, and changed nothing except understanding, and the historical record that said someone cared enough to look. The story would continue being told, passed from person to person, modified and shaped by each retelling, until it became legend as much as fact, but carrying within it essential truth about vulnerability and violence, and the importance of refusing to let victims disappear. And in that continuation, in that refusal to forget, something like justice lived even if justice itself remained forever incomplete, forever inadequate to the task of balancing what was taken against what remained.